Welcome back to Byron's study here at Newstead Abbey, everyone. Today's object doesn't look very impressive, but it's actually a very rare copy of Byron's first publication, Fugitive Pieces. There are only 4 copies left in existence. The reason that this one doesn't look very impressive is because it was rebound by a later owner in what's essentially an exercise book, and we can actually see French exercises on the inside of the back cover. Now, Fugitive Pieces was published in 1806, when Byron was just 18 years old, and it contained 38 poems written between 1802, when he was 14, and 1806. It was published by a local publisher, S&J Ridgers at Newark, and it was privately published. This meant that only a limited number of copies were made, and these were destined for specific friends. But the reason that so few copies remain today is because Byron burnt it. But why? Well, when he showed the collection to his friend, the Reverend John Beecher at Southall, Beecher said, some of these poems are a little bit too warm, and particularly the poem To Mary. And I think you'll see why if I read you a couple of verses. Even now, I cannot well forget thee. And though no more in folds of pleasure kiss follows kiss in countless measure, I hope you sometimes will regret me, and smile to think how oft were done what prudes declare a sin to actors, and never but in darkness practised, fearing to trust the telltale sun, and wisely therefore night prefer, whose dusky mantle veils their fears of this and that, of eyes and ears, affording shades to those that err. Now by my soul 'tis most delight to view each other panting, dying, in love's ecstatic posture lying, grateful to feeling as to sight. As you can see, quite spicy. And Byron did take his friend's advice, and he destroyed almost all of the copies, and he never published again To Mary, or another poem in the collection To Caroline, or the last 6 verses of To Miss E.P., or To Miss Elizabeth Pigott, which contained quite a controversial bit of writing about life after death, marriage, and free love. Our chains once dissolved and our hearts unconfined, we'll love without bonds, but we'll love you forever. So this collection of poetry was actually refigured. Poems were taken away and poems were added in, and it was republished in January of 1807 as Poems on Various Occasions. And Byron wrote to his friend John Pigott saying that he'd taken the warm poetry out because he'd been pronounced a sinner because of it. And he promised that this copy was vastly correct and marvellously chaste. He once again sort of re-edited it and went through it, taking poems away and adding them in, and published it as Hours of Idleness. Now, this was his first official or public publication, and it was really the start of his literary career. But that career started with a little bit of a fizzle because it didn't sell particularly well, and it also received a very scathing review in the Edinburgh Review, which decried the publication as containing poetry which neither gods nor men are said to permit. It's a little bit harsh, I think. It wasn't that bad. One of the interesting things about the fact that Byron republished the same poems multiple times is that we can see how he developed poetically and perhaps also politically. Let me give you an example from this poem at the beginning of the book on leaving Newstead Abbey. So in Fugitive Pieces, it starts, "Through the cracks in these battlements loud the winds whistle, for the halls of my fathers is gone to decay." Now, in Hours of Idleness, it's changed. It's made more dramatic, and it addresses the hall directly. So, "Through thy battlements, Newstead, the hollow winds whistle. Thou, the hall of my fathers, art gone to decay." It works quite a lot better, I think, poetically. There's also an interesting political change in this verse here about his family's role in the Civil War, particularly the Battle of Marston Moor, where they're fighting for the royalist cause. And in the poem it says that they were fighting for Charles the Martyr, their country defending. In the later edition it says that they were fighting for the rights of a monarch. This early version suggests a royalism to me that Byron very definitely moved away from later in his career. One of the exciting things about this edition that makes it particularly rare and interesting is that it also contains notes added by the Pigots, and also potentially by the Wildmans and Webbs, to whom this copy belonged, and who were the two families who lived in and owned Newstead after Byron. In the notes, it gives us more detail about the poems and who they're written about. One of my favourites is this one here, that tells us that this poem, To Mary on Receiving Her Picture, was about that naughty Mary, to whom the lines were written which occasioned such a commotion in the state, and were the reason of this edition being put into the fire. Now, very little is known about that Mary, although Thomas Moore suggests in his biography of Byron that she was a girl of lower social status, and Byron used to show a ring of her blonde hair to his friends. Another note, which is particularly interesting, is signed by Elizabeth Pigott and attached to the poem here, The Cornelian, which was written about John Edelston, the Cambridge chorister and Byron's more than friend. The note says that there was a youth in the choir when Lord Byron sat at Cambridge, with whose voice he was so much charmed that he frequently had him at his rooms, and grew so fond of his society from his amiable disposition and pleasing manners, that he provided for him by placing him in an advantageous mercantile concern. He died of a consumption at an early age, and his name was Edelston. This poem was written upon his giving to Lord Byron a small cornelian heart when he left Cambridge. Now, there are some inaccuracies in this bit of writing, but most of the information is taken from a letter that Byron wrote to Elizabeth in 1807, a letter that we have here in our collection, and I've made a video about it, so do go and check that out. But as I've mentioned, there are only 4 copies of this left in existence, and this actually isn't a complete copy, because you might have noticed that when we were looking at the poem To Mary, these pages look different. That's because they're facsimiles. This copy survived total destruction because it was sent to Edinburgh to Byron's friend John Pigott before the burning took place, which meant that it survived. But Byron later wrote to Pigott saying, you should just destroy it because I'm going to send you poems on various occasions, which is much better, and it doesn't contain that offending poem. But Pigott didn't destroy the collection. He removed the offending poem, and also everything after page 58 is lost. But the fact that it was sent to Edinburgh does mean that this copy survives, and it is a sort of rare and precious bit of literary survival. It's an important part of Byron's literary history because it's the beginning of his journey as a poet. It's the start of his fame, and it also gives us a little bit of a foretaste of his infamy. Thank you for joining us here today, and I hope that you've enjoyed the video. I do recommend going and reading Fugitive Pieces, and also if you have the chance, comparing it with Hours of Idleness, playing a bit of a game of Find the Difference. I'll see you next time for our next object of the month. Goodbye.